Welcome everybody. It is Wednesday 4:15 here in Eastern Europe, summer time zone, as we discussed with Jaakko earlier today, because not all of you are in the same time zone as we are. Maybe the Turku and Tampere mentioned last time. We're not quite sure which time zones you are in, but I'm sure you are happy to be here nevertheless. I will start. Anything you want to say, Jari?
Oh
I
no,
start
just
steamrolling.
great to have the second round and welcome all. Just go on.
Let's go. This course is about your success. So just as a reminder that this cocktail we have put you together is your recipe for success. As we kind of knew, some of you from the FITEC angle have some issues that you didn't know that you have an Aalto email, and that's actually the email that was given to us. So you can see a little bit of, what's the word? Existential problem maybe about we sending you emails into an email you didn't know that exists. So, but as Jaakko said earlier, if you don't get the emails, maybe you're not in this lecture either, but we'll see. Let's handle those things. But this was last time, this slide, but the main point here is that we are actually quite patient and we are asking you to be patient as well. So we're trying to fix these little glitches and, we have backup plans. We have plans B and plan C if you don't meet the deadline. So don't worry, we are really here to help you out. But be patient. There's many of you. Just like now, there's over 100 of you online. So I guess my point is we'll fix it. What about the course? Here we are. 1 down, 5 to go. Today is the 14th and it's organizational transformation. It will be me preaching all the time. So apologies for that, but let's see how it goes. And then note, big thing. So next week is a super bonus episode that we are getting 2 lectures. So Monday is a lecture day and then Wednesday as usual. But remember, next week there are 2 lectures, which also means there's going to be 2 exercises to do. It's a bit of a hassle, but like I said, we'll be fine. Don't worry. If we need extra time, we take the extra time. That's how easy it is. And then, how about last week's exercises? Let's see what you did. Let's see what came up and some comments from you as well. So just before that, a little bit of friendly reminder. Some of you forgot to send the reflections because the reflections are actually the main point of the exercise. The reflections of how did this tool work? What did you learn about this exercise as such? It is interesting to hear when you go like, okay, the other person works in a place like this, and this is their actual context. But we're actually looking at this kind of meta level of what if you took the same tool to another place and to another person, to your own workplace. So how does this tool work? What kind of things does this tool help you do? Yes. And keep in mind, you are learning about the tools to facilitate the others. So although let me just wait a second. I'm trying to mute. There's a lot of microphones on, but it's not working. Jaakko, can you check it out? A lot of people's microphones seem to be on, which I take as a sign of activity, but let's keep them muted for a while.
Yeah.
And there were some really, really good answers as well. And I picked one, Akseli Ivonen. I hope you are online. Well done, Akseli. Just as a really digging deeper, but really nicely put again this example. I hope you don't mind that I quickly show your answer as well about the reflections and kind of reflection about the exercise and reflections about the learning. So well done, Akseli and others. Some really good points made. And I picked some of them here. Kind of like, okay, what did you bring up? What happened when you did these pair exercises? Mostly you were strangers meeting each other. So one of you said or wrote, drawing someone else's context helped me see how role clarity and strategic awareness are connected. Very interesting, very good. These are the kind of things we're hoping. That you're just doing a simple thing such as drawing somebody's context. You kind of start thinking about, wow, okay, this actually means that this is clarifying people's roles, this is clarifying their strategic awareness or something this or that. Let's see what the other quote is. While the structure is organizational, the insights are deeply personal, touching on identity, values, motivation.
Risto, sulla on mikrofoni pois päältä. Risto, Risto, mute.
Sorry, my mistake. So sorry.
Yes, working again.
I tried to unmute people and I unmuted you.
That's okay. Jari making a point about my
I was messing up.
I wonder how long I was muted. I'm happy you at least have these quotes here that going through. I'll continue pretty much where I left.
Yeah.
Point being, these are quotes from you. The second one here is really saying that, hey, okay, you were drawing organizational stuff, and this person realized that actually the interpretations are very personal. I think that's a great insight. Third one, context can be defined in a lot of different ways, and beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And we thought about the definition of context from different angles. Again, excellent thing. A very different path that this pair took. They start doing the same exercise that more or less everybody was doing, but they ended up talking about, what is a context? What does it mean? How is it practical? How different angles we have with this? Let's see the last one.
Risto.
This pair work reminded me of my old sociology professor, and he said that data will speak to you when you start asking questions. My pair was now the data, and I asked her.
Yeah.
Really,
and I have something here as well.
Yeah.
I think this has been great revelation of these different perspectives we are having, how we interpret things, that there are differences, and this kind of tools can really reveal our different understanding. It's not just a single person, but when we are talking about our own context also, how we interpret as a team our own context, and that can be really surprising how differently people can see and understand the context.
Absolutely. And I have this slide from previous years because somebody brought up this classic slogan, which is, I guess, saying the same that you, Jari, just did, is that the classic example of that somebody was asking medieval stone layers, and the other one was saying that my job is to lay bricks, and the other one was saying that I'm here to build a cathedral. So it's kind of the same thing, but people have very different angles, perspectives, perceptions into, for example, the context of your work, the context of the organization. So that was definitely one of the big things that we wanted to do with this exercise, is to just show that how rich it can get. And this reminds me of another thing. When many years ago, I was at a physiotherapist, that's the word. And a physiotherapist taught me some kind of a stretch to do because I'm getting old. And then I was saying like, yeah, okay, where is this supposed to, stretch? Which muscle is it supposed to be? And then the physiotherapist told me, well, it's gonna stretch where you have the tightness. So kind of like this tool, you take the tool, start using it, and things will pop up where the organization is maybe slightly tight. So it can have very different results. Which brings me to the next quotes, was somebody said that, hey, it was actually pretty challenging to keep this exercise very simple. I had easily made it into a mind map how all the parts in his company was intertwined. So kind of looking at, hey, I could have made this much more detailed and rich, but this onion was too much simplifying. Or the second point, that my partner and I had a completely different approach to this task. I went people first, and the other one went doing first. And I think this is echoing what we just said yet before, that, hey, people, it's really interesting. How do people interpret this? What happens, when you throw in this tool into the conversation? Observe what happens, listen to what happens, see how differently people use it. Third one, is the point of the onion to figure out the people around you or the more overall context? Should the focus be on the part you can influence? Again, a great question. It's kind of like, so what's the point of this tool? And I'm going to come back to that because kind of we just gave you use this tool, but we didn't give you an agenda. So I'm kind of happy that somebody actually was like, why are we made to use this? What's really behind this?
And here I really want to emphasize this as well, because it's quite often where we start doing stuff and we don't ask why. because this is also we teachers can give you assignments, and then I think it's very healthy to ask why to do this and what's the purpose.
Absolutely. So remember, one of the things to remind here is that the tool was actually not the focus of the exercise. The point of the exercise, the focus was the conversation. The tool was important in framing the conversation and facilitating the conversation, but it was actually the conversation that happened that was probably much more interesting. A tool is a tool. Remember that. It's a tool to get things done. In this case, it was to start a good conversation about the context. And a couple of more quotations from you. Discuss that the introduced tools are nothing new. So the pairs discussed that there's nothing new in this tool. However, they sparked very interesting discussions. Yeah, that's exactly what we were hoping. And the last one, these concepts do not necessarily solve any issues, but they help build understanding and structure it. Yeah, again, these are the very kind of simple thing, a simple tool, and you can see that it really kind of opens up the richness of, hey, what do people think? What does that person think? What conversations are we having? And so forth and so forth. But like I said before, giving you the tool a week ago, actually the obvious things are really important to write down here. First of all, this onion exercise is a simplification. Of course it is. It is obviously a simplification. And it means you need to leave some things out, which means you need to focus, you need to prioritize. You probably had to make this mental decision when the other person was asking you was like, okay, I'll tell about this, but I don't think this is relevant. And then we're getting to one of the main points again. To have focus and to be able to prioritize, you actually must know why you are doing the exercise. To put it in another way, what is your agenda? What's the impact you're aiming for with this exercise? Why are you drawing the onion in the first place? Or to put it fancily, what is the change you're facilitating? And we actually didn't ask you to think about that. We just gave you the exercise, just to keep it simple, to be honest. But now you can kind of, if you look back, those of you who did the exercise was like, yeah, actually, what was my agenda? This was a tool to bring up a conversation, but kind of was it leading it somewhere? Why am I using my time to have these conversations? Why do I think that these conversations are important? And of course, the point being that if you take this into use in a real context at your work or some other context, you should clarify to yourself and probably to others, why? What's our agenda here? Why are we using this tool? What's the point? And I can give you one example kind of how to think about this. Because maybe there's a lot of you are degree students. So maybe you thought about, okay, I'll take the context of my studies. I'm looking for a master's degree. This course is part of that degree. This exercise is part of the course, and you are in the middle doing the exercise. Which is great. That's a context onion, but that's actually not an organization now, is it? That is just kind of the structure of your studies. Which, this is a comment from earlier years. There certainly are some layers and context in students' life as well, true. But the benefits from this exercise might be higher in a work-related setting. Well done. So if you start drawing this, you might actually realize that there is no organization here. Organization as a structure. Then the other point I want to make here is that maybe we can make this into an organization. Let's take this group of people. Now we are 138 people here in this lecture. And the bigger organization, everybody in this course, the ones who are taking part in this course, you and your pair and you. Now this could be said that this is already an organization and you could draw the onion. But there's no agenda for change here. You're just drawing an onion because you were asked to draw an onion. And here's the point I make. This tool actually is pretty good of understanding whether you have an organization or what is the organization that you want to change. And it shows whether you actually have a clear agenda for change as well. So this tool works best if you have an organization, like a workplace, and you have some change agenda. You have some goal that you're reaching. And you can use it kind of backwards and use this tool to figure out that, no, it's not actually. We don't have a clear organization or we don't have a clear agenda. And these are kind of the questions that this tool is really good at. What is the organization? What's the role your pair has in it? What's the desired change? What's the desired impact of that change? And we're going to get back to these later today and this week's exercise as well. I don't know if anybody thought that this was a silly exercise with a simple tool, perhaps, but maybe if you thought that the tool here will produce the results, that it's like a magical spell that once you start using the tool, it will give you clear answers, then that might be a bit a silly exercise. But I think most of you really understood that, hey, this is just facilitating the actual point of this whole thing, which is having a conversation, listening to the other person and trying to understand how you could help them to reach their goals. And that's really what we're going to get back to this week's exercise. Good. That was exercise 1, packaging it and kind of looking at what you did. And we're going to do the same for exercise 2. And exercise 2 is kind of building on top of this, but we'll talk about that later today. Few reminders from previous lecture, more or less actually, Jari, from your part. Taking a step back, remember this, being aware of the different lenses we have for our organizational reality. That we have different perspectives, different angles, and the organizational reality, there is no single truth, that we can look at it from different angles. We can look at the relationality of it, the processuality of it. We can look at it from the angle of practices. We can look at it from the perspective of culture, language, and meanings. Which the thing I'm going to highlight from last week is this point that there is no single truth about the organization you're working for. But you just have different contexts, something we thought about last week's exercise. And then we have these different lenses that Jari, you talked about last week. And there's a lot of them. It's not just like a handful, but there's probably an infinite number of them. It actually brings up the question, what on earth is an organization? If we're going to change an organization, maybe we should have an understanding, what is it that we are changing? And sorry for the text-heavy slide, but it's pretty much just saying the main points on the top is that, do we think that organization is something that is objectively measured, analyzed, and understood from the outside? Kind of like a classical scientist? Or are we more like the social constructivists that say that, hey, it's actually only exists by socially constructing and maintaining people's shared meanings and actions? And the other list over there on the left kind of points out that all of these things that Jari talked about last week was that, hey, we can take these different lenses and angles and see that the organization, we can look, organization is the language we speak. It is the practices we do. It is the teams and units we have. It is the IT systems we have, or maybe it's the physical rooms that we have, the physical seats where people sit, or maybe it's the people. And to make this even more of an abstract painting that is really difficult to pinpoint is the question that Jari highlighted, whose point of view, what point of time, in what different context? So it really brings the question, sorry that speech bubble is a bit outside. The practical question, what are you changing when you change an organization? If this course is facilitating change in an organization, where would you start? Language? Maybe. People? Maybe. IT systems? Maybe. But this is, again, there's no ready answer. You need to kind of start and be strategic about it. That which, in your case, in this situation, where should you start first? Or maybe you start in 2-3 places. Maybe you start, typically when I ask this from business people, this question in other trainings, many of them start with the narratives, the stories of what kind of an organization we would like to be. They start with a story. That wouldn't it be nice that one day our organization is this, this, and this, and this. So I actually start with a narrative, which is really interesting. But actually being that although this is very complex and rich and multifaceted, this should not paralyze you. We can still be calm, we can still be rational, we can still be analytical about it. But let's not just make the mistake that we're kind of going like, this is the truth about the organization. There's only one truth. There's an objective, neutral truth about what our workplace is. No, there isn't. That would be just stupid and unscientific, actually, because we well know that when you put a bunch of people together, it's much more complex. You cannot reduce it into one set of arrows and boxes. And then again, as a change agent, or maybe as a leader, you probably should make these reductions, if you will, simplifications, because otherwise you can't make decisions. Yes, on the one hand, let's accept that an organization is such a rich and multifaceted thing that there's no single truth about it. But to make any decisions about it, it's impossible to work with something that is too complex. So you actually, as a decision maker, probably have to make simplifications, which means if you want to make really good decisions, you should be aware of those lenses and very aware of your agenda as well. Why are you doing this simplification? For what reasons? Why are you describing our organization like this? Why did you describe the context onion just the way you did? Why? What's the agenda? Why are you doing this? Or if you don't know that, then that might be perfectly fine. And that was kind of, in one way, one point of the context onion. That you learned last week this like super simple tool of just drawing out of the millions of different contexts and lenses that any organization has. Now you have a very simple tool to start a conversation about, okay, what's the snapshot we're going to use for this project? What's the snapshot for the organizational context we're going to use today? And tomorrow, we might be redrawing this because it's such rich and multifaceted, and maybe our agenda changes. So that was kind of another way of thinking about the week 1 exercise and tying things together about Jari's talk and the exercise and packaging it now that you actually have the experience of drawing the other person's onion and figuring out what on earth does this context mean? What are these organizations? Good. I'll take a breather for about 10 seconds. Any comments? Feel free to put in the chat. Yeah, how to decide to put virtual teams into the onion. Nina already commented. That was a very good point. I would put virtual teams just like any other teams because the sociologist would in me say all teams are virtual. Jari, any comments?
Well, I agree that you can really have the virtual team as well there, and then that's quite true.
Good. Let's move on. So let's start looking a little bit, we probably cannot dig very deeper, but I'll try to do my best to scratch some really good surfaces of what does this organizational transformation then look like. And again, now that we are familiar with this onion thing, I think one way to look at it is that we can have these different lenses, whether it's the grassroots change agent perspective, or maybe it's the big outside, the biggest layer perspective, or something in the middle. But before we go and look at one example, which would be the top management perspective I'm presenting today, let's learn about the classics. It's always good to have a look and read the classics. Because like the slide is saying that organizational change, I would say it's as old as humanity. I'm sure that, somewhere in the Stone Age or even before that, when people got together, they made an organization to, hunt for food. And then somebody said that, we could change this organization a little bit. And then you had organizational change and all the fun stuff that comes with it. And therefore, it's a human endeavor, and it typically is cyclical. So, although technology changes, the world might, looks like it's changing, but typically the human stuff comes over and over and over again because we humans haven't really changed for many tens of thousands of years in a way. But the main point is learn from history, study what's been done before. And there was a person last week that was really mentioned the ADKAR model. So here are, I think I'm going to give you briefly those two models. So the ADKAR model from early 2000s, and then the even older model from the Kotter 8-step model from 1995, which are really good models. They're really good recipes of how to plan and design organizational change. And then I have the third one over there already from 1951, just to give you a point making that, it's nothing new. I mean, yeah, technologies come and go, and business models come and go, but this stuff, there's a lot of literature behind this. There's a lot of experience behind this. Yeah, Jari.
And at the same time, it's good to remember that in reality, we are a little bit having back and forth process, and there's iterations and so on. So it's not so clear sequences quite often than what's illustrated here in these models. But of course, understanding that we have to let's say organize the change process as well, understanding the context and so on. So, but still, it's a messier reality in many ways. But having understanding that there is progress happening and there's steps, even if there's steps back, but there are steps forward as well. So and so, but this of course, this kind of clear process models easily get the idea that okay, now I know what will happen, what's important. But
yeah.
Then
absolutely. The reality hits in at some point,
yeah.
But kind of as a starting point, just like a recipe, I use that, like, take a recipe book of, brewing beer. I'm looking at my beer brewing books over here. The recipe's there, and then we start cooking that recipe, things might happen. But anyway, as a recipe, these are great. I'm going to come back to that as well. So I'm not going to go them into too much detail, but I'll leave you with the slides. So here are the Kotter's 8 steps. And typically they're said that they're really focused on organizational changes when you have a diverse groups of people and you need to get them aligned. Then you have the ADKAR model, which comes from the 5 steps of awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And this is actually very human-centric because it's all about how do you bring, let's say, awareness in people? How do you, bring, the knowledge that people have the knowledge why they're changing? But the reason I'm jumping these over is because you can kind of blend these together. Like a general purpose model that is combination of ADKAR and Kotter.
Mm.
And it has these 7 steps. And I'm kind of introducing these because I think these are great recipe steps, whether you're changing a 3-person group or a 3,000-person organization. Because these are like check boxes that, this is the minimum that these are the typical steps. And the first one is that, do you have a vision? Do you know and can you communicate to everybody that what is the new organization we're looking for? Then the second point that you probably need somebody to lead this and sponsorship. It's not just that there's a person leading this, but you need other people supporting it. Other people going like, yeah, I know this. I'm behind you. I'm going to help you with this. Communication is the third step. You should probably tell people and spend quite a lot of time of having conversation, dialogues, all about this. What is it going? What are we aiming for? Listening to them and maybe changing the vision based on that. Which kind of goes to the fourth one as well. That, okay, so that people are not just being broadcasted the change. How do you actually involve people? How do you engage them? And like it says over there, the ADKAR model puts a lot of effort on training people, making sure they have the knowledge of how do they work new ways and the understanding and the skills to do something different. Then, of course, it's there's the design and the communication, and then you need to start working. You need to plan the execution of it. Where do you start? Why do you start here? Why did you start there? Do you start with the narratives? Do you start with the IT systems and that kind of questions? And once you start doing the change, how do you sustain the change? How do you build? And if people get excited and they might be, ooh, finally, we're getting, not everybody has to wear a suit at the office. How do you keep that inspiration, motivation, and everything rolling? And then these models really kind of emphasize that the final point that you keep the momentum, but then how do you sustain those wins? When you get small wins, when something changes, how do you keep that change there so it doesn't fall back to the old way? Yeah, Jari.
Yeah, I like to emphasize here what we talked last time. There was John Shook's idea that this doing is important, and I would emphasize quite a bit this that sooner we get people to get real experience, that they have capabilities to face the. So it's not just training outside first, and then we expect them to do something, but doing and training, learning, and motivating is quite bundled together. And so I think it's sooner we get people to do something with the change is important quite.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to come back to that as well.
Yeah.
And Hugo, I can see you have a hand up, but let's take that maybe after that. We'll see after I've gone through these slides, if you don't mind. Because first of all, it's kind of like, I guess this is what Jari, you were saying as well, because we actually, at least I believe, and I think we are pretty much aligned with you here. We actually start with step number 7. Typically in our philosophy, this is how we teach change, that you actually start with the culture. I'm going to get back to that because I think it's a really good question that why don't we just use the Adhikar model or the Kotter model? Why did I talk about John Shook's model last time, for example? And, don't get me wrong, they're great frameworks. Use them, of course. And here's the however. Remember this one, the third classic from 1951. So try to make my point here. Let's add some contemporary spices to this classical model that maybe didn't exist in 1951. So let's throw in some fast-moving digital landscapes. Let's throw in some uncertain global politics. Let's throw in the volatile markets. Let's, put decentralized autonomous decision-making into it and continuous data feedback loops that didn't exist in the same way in 51 and continuously updated strategies and structures. So pretty much what I'm saying, let's put this model into the super hyper uncertain, fast changing world we live in. And then it pretty much so shows kind of a well-known issue with these models, which is that especially this Lewin-Cartwright model shows you that it has this underlying theme of we have stability A, and now we just unfreeze it, and then maybe after 2 years we have stability B. And of course, by now we're quite aware that there's no such thing as stability. We need to build an organization that is dynamic, agile, responsive and reactive all the time. So it's from stability A into constant instability. So in a way, if you look at and want a kind of a checklist, what are the shortcomings? That, like I said, use the Adhikar, use the Kotter. But maybe a checklist is that, hey, first of all, remember change isn't linear. Kind of what Jari, you made the point. Change happens in different places. Mm-hmm. Change is constant. It's not a project. You cannot freeze change because you just can't. And probably there's no time to fail big. So you just cannot do a huge change, implement it for 2 to 5 years, and then realize that, hey, artificial intelligence came, it didn't work. So you need to have some kind of a change that is doing incremental small changes all the time. And so forth. Top-down change doesn't really comply with, contemporary cultures of autonomy. Training is great, but what do you actually train people for nowadays? And if culture is the key, something I talked about last time, why not start with the culture? So kind of that's where I bring in the John Shook. And the point being that you as change agents, you as leaders, you should have all of these in your toolbox. And then you kind of understand how volatile is your situation, or maybe it is very stable. And then you can do and use these recipes for the kind of cooking that you want to do, because everything is contextual and you have different lenses. So it's kind of like, yeah, these classics, read the classics, use the classics, but also have this, different perspective into it, that you start from the groundwork, from the factory floor, and you build a culture up front. And then in your leadership, you kind of pick and mix from all of these. I make it sound very simple because conceptually, that's what you have to do as a leader or a change agent. But of course, it gets a little bit complex actually getting things done. So that was kind of read the classics, but also with the classics, read the more postmodern literature. I'm kind of smiling here because my modern literature comes from 1980s, like we talked the last time, the John Shook model. But it's really, it is very contemporary nowadays, thanks to the digital world we live in. And again, I could throw the AI thing over here, thinking about organizations and the uncertainty and the rapid changes that it is causing as we speak. And there you can probably kind of figure out, okay, so it doesn't really we cannot take this kind of classical change model of stability A into stability B because nobody has an idea what stability B looks like. Okay, I promised you this before the break. So let's look, and I'm going to apply actually the classical model in some of these examples I'm showing you. So I got one example. Well, let's see. Yeah, I got one example for you, or two examples of you kind of outside perspective. A couple of transformations that I had the privilege to observe as a consultant a few years ago. So remember this from last time, the new dawn, the anti-Tayloristic vision, the responsive lean new agile culture that many companies are looking for. And one way to look at it from the outside perspective. Remember, now I'm choosing my lens from the outside and looking at how has change happened. And this is a very kind of rough model of how groups of people change. This is based on the model of how certain fashions happen or how certain, movements happen with the groups of people. And the model is simply that first you have like this, what is called disconnected pioneers, people who have new ways of thinking and they're motivated, enthusiastic. And then somehow something happens and these people meet each other and they get together and they get these like pockets of change that, hey, you like cycling too. I like cycling. Let's form this cycling club and let's do cycling kind of thing. And suddenly, there's more and more people doing cycling and stuff like that. And at then some stage, there is this big wheel of change that you have these like air pockets of change happening in the organization. And then somebody pays notice. Somebody, top management goes like, wow, we actually have these agile teams. I didn't know about this, but this is exactly what we're looking for. And then they maybe start a transformation program. There's like a big wheel of change that, okay, we need more of this. Maybe it's customer centricity. We need more of this customer centric thinking. And there's a big program. And somewhere down the line, we can see there's a new normal. There's the El Dorado, the holy grail of what we're aiming for. And in a way, like I said, just like the ADKAR models, there's a lot of good stuff of how do you actually do these things. You probably should have some surveys to figure out, especially if there's a lot of people, what do they think, what kind of things they have in their minds. You define a vision. And then the big wheel of change is kind of taking the recipe book and looking at, okay, what do I need? I probably need governance models. I need maybe pilot programs and so forth. So my example is, actually this is already quite a long time ago, the Finnish broadcasting system, Yle, as again, outside example. And this was already over 10, 15 years ago, something like that. The Finnish broadcasting company realized that they need to start building their digital capabilities, that they need to start building streaming services because that is the future. And they hired a lot of external consultants and, programmers and people who understand digital media. And these enthusiastic people brought new ways of working. Agile software development, dailies, maybe Kanbans. And what happened within the larger organization that the people, the journalists and the media professionals, they were like, hey, wow, we want to work like this as well. This is actually makes sense. These ways of working are doing. And they organized, agile PO trainings, product owner trainings, and got the connected minded people got together and had like, I can't remember, maybe it was like a coffee every last Friday of the month. But, these pockets of change started happening and you got these formal trainings that really tied people together. And maybe some of you who have been in Finland for a long time remember that it was like maybe 10 years ago, there was actually a crisis of company culture at the Finnish broadcasting company. Not the crisis we are in the middle of now, but this was the previous crisis where it was supposedly thought that the prime minister then was giving some instructions to the journalists of how to report news, and you can understand that was a big crisis. Okay, but that's not the point. The point being that there was a crisis in the company, and it was a cultural crisis, although it was a journalistic culture. But then these agile thinking people saw the opportunity that, hey, we actually have a lot of thoughts and we have been doing all these things, that once you hire, the CEO had to resign, and then once you hire the new one, could the person, take these and these thinkings into account? And that's actually what happened, and they kind of reached a new normal. They got the big wheel of change, and they had this agile yle, ketterä yle in Finnish, and that's what really happened. Now, if we look at the kind of this thing within the Kotter model, so this is Jari's point exactly, that things don't happen linearly. So if I look at this, what happened at Yle, the little I know about it, there was like step number 1 happened and step number 4 happened. And then in the pockets of change, we can see that steps 5, 6, 7, and 8 started happening. But still 2, 3, and 4, they hadn't happened yet. But then once, the top management took this on their agenda and started doing things, you can see they started forming a strategic vision and communicating that vision. But again, this just to emphasize that, yes, we can look in hindsight and see that this checked all the boxes of the Kotter model, but in real sense, it didn't go to steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that order. I have another example putting into the same model. Guess I can't tell you what company. It was a large Finnish company, not a digital company as such. And they had a very similar thing. This was like 10, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I think. A lot of enthusiastic digital people came into the large company and wanted to change things to more lean, more agile things. You got pockets of change. That's where I got involved. I was one of the trainers of these, accelerators within the company of helping teams to work in different ways, more agile, more design-oriented, and so forth. But unlike in the broadcasting company, in this large company, the change did not happen. For reasons that actually I don't know, there was probably not top management buy-in. They had these accelerators, they had these pilot programs, but then nothing really happened. So they kind of went back to the old normal. But then the funny thing was, what this arrow in the bottom shows you was that 2, 3 years afterwards, I was there again in the same company doing the similar stuff, because they had kind of started again. That, okay, maybe this time this actually works. And this actually has worked. I think these companies are very good at the moment in their digital services and the changes they have made. But kind of point being that, of course, it doesn't necessarily happen all the time. Maybe the context wasn't right. Maybe the people weren't ready. Maybe the leaders were not ready for the change. And then if you put this into the Kotter model, you can see kind of similar things, but then definitely in hindsight, you can see that step number 2, 3, 4, and 8 never happened. So the change kind of obviously did not happen there. So back to the Yle case, kind of, okay, what did then happen? If this was a successful story of organizational change, that they became more agile, whatever that means for them within the company. The interesting thing that actually happened was that all the people who were driving this change, all the people behind the agile change, were kind of like, okay, what do we do now? That we got this amazing, we got kind of what we wanted. We met the objectives. It's kind of like they built this boat that is new and more agile and really fast, but they didn't know where to go with it. And just to me, that's always a reminder that when you are leading change or driving change, it actually making the change happen is so much taking your energy and focus that you kind of forget that once the change has happened, what do we actually do with it in an organization? But in Yle's case, the good story is that they actually had, at the same time, done a lot of strategic work, and they kind of were driving the company for this digital customer experience as the whole organizational goal, and this agile and lean culture that they had just built fit that really nicely. So now we are more agile, we're more lean as an organization to create digital customer experiences as good as possible. So because before that, it was just, being agile, being lean, or being customer centric, they cannot be the goals in themselves, can they? Organizations have organizational goals, so you need to kind of tie them together. And there's, by the way, is here in the bottom of the slide is the master thesis that was done that really goes into the story of Yle if you want to check it out. And that's actually where we are kind of at the moment, is that there's a lot of, in the past 5 years, a lot of writings and decades and conversations is that, okay, once we have done the huge overhaul of becoming more lean or becoming more agile or becoming more design oriented, what next? What do we do with this? And you can see kind of questions popping up. So what's the actual organization architecture now? It's not just that people know how to be lean or be customer centric. How do we organize the organization based on this? And what kind of governance models support this? And what kind of digital tools support this, and so forth and so on. Okay, time for a break. So I need to tell you what was the main point. The main point of these 2 examples, short ones, yes, was that the company culture changes even if there's no official change program. So that's a fact. And the other thing is that the change is not linear. It kind of happens in leaps. It jumps. So you kind of be aware of that. That's how change typically happens. And the other point I want to make is that both of these examples kind of start from inside out. They start kind of, how do I change the people? How does the teams change? And when the teams have, how does the unit change? So kind of from small to big. But that's only because these are established, existing organizations, like, most organizations are. But if you could really start from scratch, you wouldn't do it like that. If you were a startup, if you would start from zero, then you would actually start from the outside in. You would start at, okay, why do we start this company? Why does this company exist in this domain? What's our competitive advantage? And then you would go inside into the onion and so forth. So the onion should be drawn from top to bottom if you could start from scratch. Which brings me to my last point before the break, is that, just to make the maybe obvious thing, that in large organizations, transformations happen inside out because they are not a clean slate. However, the rationale for change, the reason why this large organization is changing, should be from the outside in. Because at the end of the day, as we talked last time, success always is defined by the context outside. So that's the point. A little bit over time, but we're going to have a 5-minute break. So let's continue. 8 minutes past. Let's see if you can resist and not look into the emails or anything. 5-minute break. Thanks for asking the questions. Actually, Hayan was asking, and thanks for Jari for answering. Now we're back. It is 8 past, whatever time zone you are in, unless you are those one of few time zones on this planet that is not like even hour, but it's like half an hour, 45 minutes. I've been told there are such places. Nevertheless, if lens number 1 was outside perspective, lens number 2 I'm going to introduce to you next is transforming a company culture from a top management perspective. And I put the word consultant also there because typically management consultants are consulting top management, and they have more or less the same perspective of how to actually do change because, yeah, makes sense, doesn't it? So kind of your roadmap for a new company culture, which is another recipe, and I'm going to have, again, the Kotter model there to side by side about these steps that I'm going to tell you about. And this is another model, kind of 6 steps, foundation stones for cultural transformation. This is work I did already way back when I was a management consultant at Bearing Point, doing these transformations with my colleagues. And so it's kind of based on both experience of actual management consultants doing these things, plus the kind of literature behind it. And like I'm saying, that the recipe is not difficult. It's actually then well, you'll probably see where the difficulties come in, and I'm going to ask you to talk about them in the breakout room. So, okay, step number one, obviously, is the top level desire for change. So this is kind of a showstopper, if you will. If the top management who's responsible doesn't want to change, well, then yes. So in a way, you could think that you as an employee, you're being asked, okay, boss, you want me to change, but are you ready to change yourself? I think that's the very simple question. And in a way, in the Kotter model, it's really creating the sense of urgency and building a coalition. So there are more than one person who wants to change. And typically the question for top management change that you might be listening or even asking the top management is that, okay, change requires learning. Change requires experiments. Are these seen as an investment or are these seen as an extra costs? And that will speak volumes about the top level's attitude towards changes. And the second line over there, doing things differently, which is change, probably there's a lot of failures. There's going to be things that didn't go as planned. So are these inherently there? Is top management happy with these? Or if the top management is asking people to take more risk, to be more experimental, do they understand that asking for more risk actually produces more failures, doesn't it? And then I'm going to highlight the last point here as well, that you can look at the big executives and the bosses, or even the small bosses. Are they changing themselves? What are they doing? And if you are this boss person, then you should probably really demonstrate to others that, hey, I'm changing. I'm trying out new things. I'm learning. So that was step number one. Step number two, just like in the Kotter model and the Adkar model, you probably should have a strategy and a vision that people can follow. So again, from an employee's perspective, yeah, you want me to change, but change to what? You need to communicate. To change to what? What do you want from me? What's the new me going to be about? And in the Kotter model, it's really about forming a strategic vision and communicating that vision. So simple questions again, just taking a basic school book on strategy and asking, and then telling other people, how is your industry changing? And who is changing it? And what's your stance in it? What about the customers? How are they changing? Who do they want to become? What are we going to do because of this and what we are not going to do because of this? And then people can go like, okay, you thought this out. Oh, yeah, now I understand why are we changing and what we are changing into. And now I can probably start guessing how I personally have to change. That was step number two. So number one, top management, desire for change. Second, some kind of a strategy and a vision. What are we going to do? Where do we want to go? And then my favorite is the supportive structures, the scaffolding for the change. Because it's the obvious thing that you can ask people to work differently and change. But if the pipes and plumbing of your organization will not change, then people will eventually fall back to the old ways of working. That is just obvious, and it's very often overlooked. So that's kind of really another way of looking at it is that, okay, again, dear boss, you want me to change. How will you support that change? Are you just asking each individual to work differently, but everything else remains the same? The tools remain the same. My career path remains the same. Which in the Kotter model is more or less the step number 5, that you as a leader should start removing the obstacles and enable people to act differently, do differently. And that's only how change happens. So the supportive structures, we could go on, but a couple of things I want to highlight here are kind of what are the decision-making principles? How do people make decisions? If it's very cumbersome, if it's very bureaucratic, it's very difficult to ask people to change into more agile and autonomous decision-making. Simple as that. What are the goal-setting principles? OKRs are very popular at the moment. And mainly because of this, because they see that, okay, if we change some of the fundamentals of how an organization is run, such as goal setting and the way that we communicate about objectives, then things will actually change. The third one, what's the measurement for success? What does success mean and how is it measured? If my bonuses at the end of the year are based on the old metrics, it might be a bit challenging to ask me to work in a new way if at the end of the day the pipes and the plumbing are still the old ones. Which brings me to the governance models, portfolio support, kind of these sometimes thought to be these gray, boring things. But hey, these are the pipes and the plumbing of an organization. And we all know if we take away electricity, sewers, running water, it will change a lot of things, don't it? And then last but not least, kind of what are the critical ways of working? What are the critical tools, operating models in an organization? How do we do? And you can see this really echoes the John Shook thing from last time. This is really what I'm emphasizing here is that you need to start the change from what people do. And when you think about it, it's really about the kind of the pipes, the plumbing, the wiring, the sewers, the basic stuff, the physical spaces that people have, the tools that they use. They have a huge effect on what people do. And that's also kind of the invisible infrastructure. Okay, like I said, I could go on and on about this. Step number 4, what are the capabilities and competencies? If you want me to change, dear boss, do I need to become something? Do I need to, this is what the Adhikar model does really, it really puts a lot of effort into. That you need to change people, which means you need to change their skills, their knowledge, maybe their motivation as well. So from a top management perspective, it's questions such like, okay, what systems, what legacy systems we're going to work with and which ones we're going to overhaul. What's the strategy for getting new, fresh people in? Or are we not recruiting anybody, but we're retraining people? So how do we change the people, actually? That's kind of the people perspective into organization. And then again, these kind of basic things, how mature are we about design thinking or agile development or data analytics or AI nowadays? These are the capabilities of an organization. So capability really means that you cannot ask an organization to be something unless they're capable of it. Duh. Simple like that, although it sounds like fancy consulting word. But then second to last, where should you start? What's the very first place you start? You're probably not going to overhaul the whole organization at once, but you're going to be maybe strategic about the pilots, the spearhead projects. And the reason I have the picture of the penguins here is that there's this phrase of a first penguin. Maybe some of you know this, but of course it means that, or supposedly penguins are on an ice like that and they get hungry and they know there's fish in the water, but there might be predators as well. There might be a killer whale in the water, so they don't jump. Until somebody gets so hungry that the first penguin jumps in and everybody else watches whether there is a killer whale and that survives. And if there's no killer whale, everybody else follows. So that's kind of the penguins. So what's the first penguin? Where do you start these things? I hope Shelley is online because Shelley probably remembers way back a lot about penguins we talked about.
Yes, sir, I certainly do.
Thank you, Shelley. So the point being that, okay, dear boss person, you want me to change. So what are the first steps to take? Where should I jump into the cold waters first? So in the Kotter model, of course, it is actually the point number 4 is that you kind of nowadays, because we're so much dependent on individual experts, it's how do you kind of enlist these peoples, these experts to start doing the change, on their own motivation. And also the generating the short-term wins. So basic questions such as, how do they adopt these new ways of working, new ways of thinking? What are the pilots? What are the very first projects that are going to do things differently? And maybe later on, I'm going to come back to this model that you can actually do change by having these internal accelerators and showing within the company that we can work in new ways. And then, of course, how do you communicate these spearheads? How do you communicate the success of these penguins? Or maybe they failed, maybe there was a predator and they all died. What are you going to do then? How are you going to communicate that? And then last but not least, That was maybe the spearhead. That was the pilots. Those were the penguins. How do you scale up? How do you reorganize the whole organizations? So it's kind of like a, again, dear boss, you want me to change? Okay, you told me the first step, but what are the second, third, fourth steps? When are we going to reach the El Dorado? When are we going to be ready? And have you planned these steps? And probably you have, because you maybe took the Kotter model. So it's really for you from the top management, how are they going to sustain and consolidate the little changes that are happening? And then kind of the next step is really anchoring those changes into the culture. I like the word institutionalizing here. So it kind of becomes a boring bureaucratic thing, means that this is pretty much institutionalized, this new way of working into the culture. So in the last sense, it might be practical questions for the top management. Is really about how do you communicate this? During the change, how do you communicate the results? How do you communicate maybe, side steps or missteps? Maybe you communicate failures. Hey, we thought that this is the way of working, but it turns out it wasn't. These penguins were eaten. I'm happy there were only 10 of them. No. But the second point, how do you gather learnings from this? You should probably be systematic about this, because it becomes this build, measure, learn loop again. How do you do these experiments, spearheads? How do you do these changes? And how do you, sustain them? And how do you learn? Because all the time you are learning that how does this philosophy, how does this vision, how do these steps that I planned actually work in the reality of our organization? And then, of course, the third point is that this should be really, really up, as high up in the organization agenda as possible, so that kind of everybody's on board and everybody understands that this is probably going to take some time and effort, and it's going to be maybe away from some other activities. And then last but not least, what are the success criteria? How do you measure? It's not just like what are the metrics for the new normal? What are the metrics for the new culture? But what are the metrics for the transition while you are transforming the organization? And this might sound really big because, this is, typically top management talk is big, but I really say that this Kotter model and these recipes even work for a team of 5 people. You just kind of adapt them into the smaller context. So let's say we are 5 people and we want to change. What are the metrics of, are we on the right path of change? These are really good questions to ask. So that's kind of like I'm saying, in a way, it's not rocket science how, the steps to take in a small or big change, but it's actually, that's where the rocket science comes in, is that how do you actually then kind of play the recipe or the notes, and what happens, and have you covered all the bases? And that's pretty much an experience matters there as well, and not just book knowledge. Okay, that was that. Now I'm going to ask you, unless, Jari, do you have anything you want to add at this moment? You're on mute. No, Jari. No, yes or no, but no comments or yes comments. Oh, there you are. Now you're not unmuted.
Well, sorry. Yeah, I was unmuted.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's really about experience and experience of stuff and reflections as well. That what's not maybe emphasized too much is that when you do stuff, then you have to also make meanings and repeat. And then this experiential part is always quite pivotal, people to get on board and get experience. And then the people are here, as you were talking about the spearheads, that there are different rhythm, that there are this first pioneers and then the followers and so forth. But really being patient. And from top management perspective, the patience is quite often that when higher management is really planning and they have been thinking that now we have to change, then they must. It will take patience to take care that the whole organization has has adopted the new stuff, but quite often they are thinking next steps already before the tail of the organization is really involved and engaged to new stuff. And so that's quite often raising some tensions within the change as well. And the one thing is always remembering that there's constant change. So we are already in motion in organization. So there is not this kind of stableness so much anymore, even if it's look like that, but it's never kind of stable.
Kind of like the funny thing that I think that nowadays a lot of organizations is that they are having these change programs or projects to change the organization into something that is constantly changing.
Yes,
because that was the mistake from the classic model.
Yeah.
Is that, you know,
and very good question is about the culture, because culture is also that we routinize or institutionalize stuff in a way, try to create something stabilize. But then can we create a kind of culture of constant change? And what kind of culture is it? That we are embracing change all the time, because we need also stability in some senses, and then again being curious how we can improve. But so I think this is also a little bit tricky, because I think if we are changing all the time, then we are in the beginning of the process all the time as well, and we can't really get the results that we also routinize and create new practice and so on, and we need also that.
But actually, next I'm going to ask you to, again, go to the breakout rooms randomly assigned. Let us know if there's some challenges and we can reassign you or move you virtually. But the question, in those rooms is just to have just a free discussion. What is probably difficult in implementing these things? If you're a leader, what is difficult? If you're the grassroots worker, what's difficult? And I guess all of you have experiences of this, even if you feel that you're a young student and haven't been in the work life. I mean, you probably have been in some organizational changes, but don't worry about that. Just have an open conversation. And here's kind of, I let you this change leader checklist, these six steps I just gave you. And then again, kind of if you want to take the perspective of the employee, and these are the questions to ask the change leader. And, just have a conversation. What are the blocks, the roadblocks, or what makes this difficult in reality? If I was saying this is easy, like, cooking food, now you can go like, no, it's not. This is what makes it difficult. So about 10 minutes, and let's go, Jaakko. Breakout rooms. People with big salaries push change. Well, that's interesting. Maybe because people with big salaries maybe sometimes are the obstacles for change because they don't want to lose their big salaries. Poor communication, lack of visible results. Yeah, lack of visible results is a good point. Change is a threat for the brain. Well said, Lotta. I think it really actually boils down to very much individual psychology as well. That, are we in a mindset that, maybe our outside work life is quite full of things? Do you really want to add that even your job, you can't remain stable, but you need to find the extra energy to change? Balancing different goals. People are psychologically conservative and are thus hard to change. Yeah, kind of same thing. But I think that's important because it pops up. Small company constantly changing and learning in some ways. Easier to adopt, more used to it. Yeah, Jari and myself just quickly here while we were waiting for you touched upon the thing that there is this kind of attraction, generally speaking, of forming smaller and smaller companies because large companies become this, this is exactly what you talked about. The larger the company, the more difficult it is to change. And if constant change is the road to success, then you kind of just add 1 + 1, large, difficult. So what if we just reorganize ourselves into a bunch of small companies, which in my way is one of the big trends in the culture change discussion, is that I think we are way past of having a dogmatic monoculture in large companies. And progressive companies are embracing the fact that within our multinational organization, we have plenty of microcultures, that there is not one culture that everybody should obey. And I think that's a trend that's going to be even bigger and bigger. Good. Wow, there's a lot of stuff.
I think it's great summaries in 10 minutes. I think it.
That's a good
To be
point.
honest.
Let's see if there's anything I highlight. Highlight by just randomly, not saying that these are good or bad. In the army, there is a habit of the leader giving the assignment to your employees, who then recommend solutions for the mission, and then those solutions are brought together to make assignment order. It helps to make people committed to the mission. That's a good point. I'm actually a big fan of some of the army protocols. I think the army, I might be coming back to this later in this course, but the army, because it's there's such a long tradition historically for dealing in uncertainty and facing uncertain situations. There's actually a lot of good practices and ways of working, especially in this situation. So anyway, thanks, Aku, for bringing that up. All right. Typical organizational roadblocks. I would say that one of them is the pipes and the plumbing. This is something I ranted about earlier, which governance is a good word for it. PMO, the project management office, or whatever the PMO stands for in typical corporate jargon, is kind of the gatekeeper of how do you do things and how are you I think it is ideally there to harmonize ways of working, but it can turn into being the blocking part, the bottleneck for change as well. Valuation models, I think these are really important in the world we live in, where everything has some value. I'm not saying it has to be money, but it might be some abstract customer value. But this is kind of like, what are the models that our organization use for calculating value? And because those models have a lot of assumptions about certainty, they have a lot of assumptions about, predictability. And if those are not holding true anymore, then the valuation models. And I think the classic example is that you're asked to innovate something the company has never done before. And then you need to make clear cash flow calculations for the next 5 years of something you don't know what it is and nobody else has done. And then you can see the kind of the contradiction, the valuation model, because the valuation models, of course, are hugely influential in decision making as well. Should the organization invest on that, or that, then the way that the future value of those investments is calculated plays an important role. And then this brings the other monetary thing is, of course, is the budgeting and the budgeting cycles. If a large organization does budgeting once a year, then the kind of the clock speed of change is perhaps once a year. And then kind of the principles of budgeting, which is related, of course, to the valuation models, but not just the valuation models. It's also kind of like those of you maybe who are working in the public sector, which is very kind of budget driven. Then the public sector, the rule of thumb, of course, is that you should spend all the money, because if you don't spend all the money that you are budgeted, the next year you're going to get less money. And you can see how those, the way that the budgeting is done and the principles of budgeting really affects the way of working quite directly. And then I mentioned earlier, the portfolio management is a fact that when you have more projects, when you have more initiatives, or let's say more products in a company, then the portfolio level, how is it balancing between all of these different projects and initiatives, and how is that managed? And how are those projects evaluated? Becomes actually another pipes and plumbing issue. But not all about money as well. I think there is this just change requires discussion. It requires people to mentally digest things, and a good way of mentally digesting is to talking with your colleagues and then having these conversations that maybe are unproductive, if you will, and just meeting other people, getting to know, building those connections and things that Jari, you keep on highlighting many times here. And then last but not definitely least, the thing I want to point out is the career models, because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road in a way, that you're working in this place and you have been given this path forward, which is the career model, and which is that's gonna dictate your salary and your promotions and pretty much everything in your individual work. So if those things are not changing, then, like I said earlier, then people fall back to the old ways of working. And nowadays, in the uncertainty and the creativeness that is, and innovativeness that is many of the goals of organizations, risk taking, failures, they're always a good conversation to have. Should I take risk? And if I fail, what happens to my career path? My scorecards and so forth. But kind of the main point I want to do before starting to wrap up for today is that culture transformations, like, last week already I brought up the concept of a culture, that it's a holistic change that organizations are having nowadays. And it's more or less a change from a stable organization into an organization that is quite comfortable in constant change. And of course, it's a huge change. That's kind of what people have learned, more or less. And the word culture is good because it embraces almost everything. But it also means that it's very holistic, the change. And I'm hoping that some of the models and the examples I'm showing here kind of really try to look that there's so many angles to look into this. And the thing that I highlighted in, earlier today and Jari highlighted last week was that organizations are freaking complex things. So that's kind of makes it a little bit difficult in practice. And there's always a chance to throw your hands in the air and go like, man, this is too complex, I'll do nothing. But maybe you don't have that luxury, and then kind of that's why you need to simplify and to reduce. But the point kind of being here that culture transformations are very big things, they're very holistic things. And sometimes they may be just thought as a project, let's just make this lean training within our company and, things are going to happen. Or, we have this agile initiative and then we're becoming this better organization. No. It doesn't work like that. It includes a holistic change, includes changes in strategy, changes in capabilities, changes in innovations, structures, governance models, and then really highlighting the top executives themselves. Actually, it comes to my mind like maybe 10, 15 years ago, as a consultant in this domain, I was kind of like, well, isn't it obvious that the top management has to change? I kind of thought that it was a bit, silly to keep on reminding of that. Maybe it was because as a consultant, I was always hired by those top managers who are willing to change. So I thought it was obvious. But as I got older and hopefully wiser, I have kept that highlighted there because I have noticed that no, this can be in many, many places as simple as that the top management really, truly, sincerely does not want to change. So it kind of becomes this theater of being more agile or theater of change. And no, that's not going to really happen. I guess that's getting old and slightly more cynical. Hope that doesn't happen much. Yeah, but that was pretty much the rant of today. Jari, yes, I was just about to ask, what do you think?
Yeah. Just going to your previous slide concerning the talk. Is it allowed to talk and have conversations in organizations? So we tend to measure our time that we have to be performative, and what we talk is about the content. But I think in organizing, how to maintain the organization requires that we make meanings. We talk also about the organizing or how we do stuff. And so it's not just talking about the content, but talking about the content. So I would say that we have to have this kind of maintenance practices in organization, but that we are pretty poor. And if we would then want to change, then we have to have a good practice to talk about the change and invest some time to that. But actually, we should also take time for talking about our organization and when we are in constant change as well. And so I think that's something we are missing as well, because then we quite often talk when something doesn't work or not, but then we fix it, but we don't have this kind of continuous reflection kind of stuff. And that, I would argue, would be needed more in this continuously changing organization.
Yeah, that reminds me of of the thing that we actually did together with you in this winter was this kind of maybe framing it like a personal trainer perspective. The slide, if everybody remembers from the very first, that this is kind of like, you're saying the maintenance talk is really about that, yeah, you might be, practicing for some sport, but do you have your basic core maintained? Do you have the basic, cardiovascular in place?
Yeah, but that's.
So I'm kind of highlighting that this is exactly, I fully agree with your point that, the basics of an organization.
And actually,
how's your core doing?
Yeah. And I would compare sometimes that when an engineer design a machine, has very, very carefully also designing how to maintain the machine, how to measure it, and so on. And in knowledge work, organization is the machine. But do we have a measurement? How does it work? And do we stop it and sometimes have a maintenance pause? And that's something that we should have, and also have these checkpoints in meanwhile. And so that's something which is quite often missing as a practice.
Okay, let's see what we got for you cooking this week. Exercise number 2, and it is an onion. It's not an onion, but let's call it the temporal onion. Deadline Monday. Actually, yeah, I'll get back to that. Check the email because we're having a lecture Monday, so I need to go through some of the exercises. That's it. Oh, let me worry about that a little bit. Here's the exercise. That will not change whatever happens. Drawing and asking the temporal context. So if last time it was like organizational, now I'm asking, like before, during, after. Let's keep it simple and see how it goes. So last week, there was the point that success always is defined from the outside. The success of an individual team is designed by, the organization, success of a unit by the company, the success of a company by market. So yes, this is great, but it's static. Doesn't imply change, does it? So how do you draw it in a timeline? And here's kind of how you draw it. You just draw it in a timeline. So you have stuff coming from the outside, the kind of needs and demands. Then you do your thing. And then when you're ready, the impact happens again outside your sphere, kind of like this. Let's take a project, for example. It comes from somewhere. Something has happened before the project started. So project is never in a vacuum. It comes from somewhere. People have experiences, backgrounds. Organization has a history. It has previous projects, okay? And then once the project is done, the impact of that project obviously happens somewhere else outside the project because the project was just done, okay? So kind of the same thinking that your success is defined outside of what you are doing. And if last week it was about the organizational context, now it's kind of like, how do you understand the temporal context? What has happened before? And what do people believe or expect to happen in the future? Okay, I try to really make this simple. So how do you plan? I think a project is a good example. Everybody more or less understands. It has a beginning, it has an end. So in the beginning, it has a context that it is happening. And at the end of the project, if it's a good project, there's some kind of a definition of done. Good. But this is kind of navel gazing, isn't it? This is small picture. It's kind of selfish as well. You're just thinking about their project. But what about everybody else who's not in the project or involved in it? So let's put it into a timeline. So one way, and I think this is a simple way of, tell me once you do the exercise that do you agree, that you start the project by looking way into the future. So what's the kind of the desired impact that once this project has been done and dusted and like 6 months after it finished, what has happened? What kind of impact has happened? So that like in this example, what has happened in 1 year after the project was successful? What's the desired impact? And then you kind of go back. Okay, if this is what we want to change 1 year after the project was done, what has had to happen in 6 months after the project was done? And then what has had to happen in 1 month after the project is done? And which means that once the project ends, what do we have to have done and ready so that after 1 month, this change will happen, and in 6 months, this will happen, and in 12 months, this will happen. Another way of thinking about this, like, 1 year after the project was done, what would you like people to say if they go like, man, it was fantastic that we had that project because now this, and this has happened. So that's kind of your thinking forward into the future, kind of understanding the temporal context of the future. And of course, same goes into the past. What is the history? Where does this come from? What has been done before? What exists already? Which means that in the beginning of the project, you have a pretty good idea what needs to be ready before the project starts. What do you need to understand so that this individual project is successful? So, in all simplicity, just asking these questions, you plan the whole work in a larger context of what's the impact that we desire. Not the end result of the project, not the deliverables of the project, not the definition of the done of the project, all are important. But if you want to be more strategic, then just like the context onion, you look beyond the project into the desired impacts somewhere in the future. Sounds childish, sounds obvious, not scientific. This tool, this way of doing it. But yeah, remember, the tool is not a magic spell. It's not like just drawing this will solve all your problems. It's just a tool, If you have a hammer, it doesn't mean that you have a house automatically. But once you do this exercise, pay attention to the process that happens, that it actually facilitates. And again, we're going to do the similar thing as last week, that you're going to draw the other person's temporal onion, if you will. And then maybe afterwards have a conversation. What was difficult? Was it difficult to understand the past? Was it difficult to put yourself into the future position? What was easy? What was something unclear? Just again, do this so you can surface these things that, wow, interesting. This seems to be difficult and that seems to be easy. And maybe you can start understanding the root causes of the other person's organization. So here's the actual formal slide. Draw the before and after of your pair's work. So everybody choose a project, existing one, past project, something just, Play-Doh to work with. And then the other person will facilitate and spar you with these questions. And look at the slide, 3 slides before this one to get the questions. So just to draw the before, during, and after of an ideal, the other person's project. And then you switch roles. And now remember, do the reflections. I'm kind of hoping that's the fun part. But I'm sure the previous part is as amusing as the reflections as well. But reflections is where you probably learn. And that's it. Don't leave yet, because here's the key takeaways. I'm not going to read them. You can check them out in the slides once you get them. A couple of further readings, actually a lot of readings here. Some of them are publicly available. Some of them are behind a paywall, because some of the academic articles are. And here's your checklist. Attendance form. I'm sure Jaakko has broadcasted it already a couple of times. There we go. Jaakko did already that just as we speak. So those of you who need the attendance, go and check your boxes. And as you probably noticed, there's a little field for comments. So thank you for all the comments you did. And then I put this speech bubble. If you're leaving the course, if you, for whatever reason, go like, okay, I can't take this anymore, let us know, because it helps with the pairing to know that this person is not available anymore. Yes. All of the materials will be in Google Drive. You get the link, and Annika and Jaakko will probably tomorrow, the latest, do the pairing.
Yeah.
And, any questions, ask us at the email.
Yeah. Someone asked about are the pairs same or not. So there will be new pairs, right?
New pairs, absolutely. That's the fun. Unless you have the privilege of a fixed pair, then you are stuck. See you on May the 19th. It's Monday. Poof, poof, poof. My light's flashing. It's Monday. We see you on Monday and Wednesday next week. So I think Monday it is me here in my garage doing most of the talking. And on Wednesday, it's Jari, your turn to take the main stage. So, but that's the last slide. And it is 6 o'clock here in Eastern European summertime zone. So we are done. Thank you again for all the comments, all the conversations, for your participation, and